So today I woke up and I thought to myself, you know what I want to do today? I want to piss off the Resident Evil community by taking jabs at ourselves, because let's face it guys, we are one of the most passionate video game communities out there, but straight up, we are also one of the most toxic when it comes to debating our own beliefs and opinions with others. Seriously, I can't tell you how many times I scroll through Twitter or YouTube posts in which I find someone calmly stating their own opinion, and just like that, a riot breaks out in the comments as a line is drawn in the sand and people begin to get vicious defending their own beliefs. Funny enough though, it always seems to be the same topics that are up for debate, and on this episode of Nerd Space Games, we're gonna have a lot of fun today and potentially stir up the pot just a little bit. Yeah, that's because we're taking a look at the 10 most controversial debates in the Resident Evil community. And to make things a little more interesting and potentially putting myself in the line of fire for all of you watching this video right now, yeah, I'm gonna say which side of the line in the sand you'll find me on. So viewers beware, stay out of the comments if you have a weak heart. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and here are the 10 most controversial debates in the Resident Evil community today. Let's get it. Number 1, fixed camera versus over-the-shoulder third person. Notice how I left first person out, because quite honestly, the people that prefer first person Resident Evil games are probably the calmest in the entire community. Or at least they are the quietest, because I never see anybody that loves first person Resident Evil attacking the other two groups. So looking at fixed camera versus third person, obviously fixed camera combined with tank controls is more connected to older Resident Evil games. You have the original trilogy, RE0, RE1 Remake, and Code Veronica, just to name a few. Considering that most of these games were released before the early 2000s, obviously a majority of the fans that prefer these games are the ones that grew up playing Resident Evil since the series started 30 years ago. And yeah, I put myself into that group as well. Since my first Resident Evil game was RE2 OG back in 1998, it's still to this day my favorite Resident Evil game. Clearly, I have a deep connection for fixed camera angle games in the franchise. But yeah, that same passion of mine carries over to other Resident Evil clones that we get nowadays that just really went over my heart immediately, like Tormented Souls 2, and Echoes of the Living, for example. However, even as someone that grew up with those games and prefers fixed cameras, I totally appreciate modern Resident Evil games that feature over-the-shoulder third person, and it makes perfect sense why Capcom decided to switch over to this perspective. Still, if you really want to get the Resident Evil fanbase riled up, then the best way to do is to walk into the room full of both new and old RE fans and say fixed camera rules, third person sucks ass, or vice versa. The result will be a bloodshed. Number 2, remakes versus originals. While we are still on the topic of old versus new RE fans, we might as well address another major issue that fans in the RE community just can't stop fighting over. Which Resident Evil games are better, the originals or the remakes? Now look, I'm someone that appreciates both versions of each Resident Evil game. Hell, RE3 Remake, while it has its flaws and it obviously cut a lot of content that was featured in the original game, is still a fun experience for me, and I appreciate it for what it was. However, some Resident Evil fans will get extremely toxic about their beliefs and basically attack others for liking one version of the game over the other. For example, on the side of fans that prefer the original, you have the famous video right here that went viral when RE4 Remake first released. This video alone completely caused an uproar within the community, damaging the image of Resident Evil 4 Remake by calling it soulless in comparison to the original game. Yeah, I'm sure if you guys have been around on YouTube during that time, you probably saw this video. Anyway, no hate to the creator, as he was just stating his opinion, but the community became extremely aggressive and toxic towards each other, with fans of the original attacking fans of RE4 Remake, saying that they weren't true fans. The same argument can be made from the other side of the fence too. Fans of RE4 Remake would straight up say that people who enjoyed the original game more were blinded by nostalgia, and this argument would not only stick with RE4 but fall to the rest of the remakes as well. For me personally, I'm someone that finds myself in the middle. For example, I like RE1 and RE4 remakes better than the originals, but I enjoyed the original RE2 and RE3 a lot more. Regardless, there's things I appreciate in each version, whether that's Leon's voice and one-liners in the original or a combat system in RE4 Remake. Both the originals and the remakes of the franchise have things that appeal to me, and I don't think there's really any reason to attack someone for having a different opinion of what generation of RE games they prefer. Number 3, Leon S. Kennedy. Speaking of our favorite rookie cop, I think it's worth mentioning that while Leon Kennedy might be viewed as Capcom's golden boy, and there's no denying that he's a fan favorite within the series, he's also a character that for whatever reason has caused a lot of fights between RE fans online. Usually the arguments around Leon as a character are mostly directed towards the fact that he has appeared in a lot of Resident Evil games, while characters like Claire Redfield and Jill Valentine are kind of just left in the dust. Especially Claire Redfield. Jesus, why Capcom? Why wouldn't you give this poor girl some more attention. Anyway, while Leon is clearly a moneymaker for Capcom, there's fans straight up posting comments and tweeting stuff like, Leon is in RE9, automatic boycott. Yeah, straight up, people are saying that they are actually boycotting RE9 just because Leon is in the game. I'm not even making that up. That's not even an exaggeration. I've actually had people come into my streams or my comments on my videos saying those exact words. This is a legit thing, guys. But yeah, as I said, most of this hate is just because he's front and center in all forms of media related to Resident Evil right now. He's the only character to appear in every single CG film. In the last decade, he's appeared in 3 Resident Evil games, more than any other character, with Chris Redfield coming close with 2 appearances. And he's just constantly talked about no matter where you go online. So yeah, I get it. Fans of other RE characters are just upset that other legacy characters just don't get as much love as Leon does. On the other side of things, Leon is just a more likable character to more fans out there, especially the casual fans of the community. A big reason for that comes from the same reason why the Leon haters are, well, hating on him. Leon has been the poster boy in 3 of the last 5 Resident Evil games. Because of that, he's more familiar with a lot of the newer fans of the series, while also being a character that's connected to the older games that a lot of us grew up with, like RE2 OG and RE4 OG. So he's kind of that character that really appeals to every generation of Resident Evil players, rather that's the 90s fans that grew up with RE2, the action horror fans that enjoyed him in the early 2000s, or the newer fans of the series that know him from the remakes. Leon is just the easiest person to connect to a wider audience, and hence that's why he has more fans out there, and that's why Capcom just loves bringing him back over and over again. For me, Leon's not even in my top 3 favorite characters of the franchise, but I'm also not dumb enough to not realize how popular he is with fans of the franchise. Just in case you're wondering though, unpopular opinion here, but my top 3 are Chris, Rebecca, and Jill in that order. Crazy, right? Number 4, survival horror versus action horror. While this debate isn't as vocal as a lot of the other topics featured in today's video are, it's still something that is low-key heavily talked about between the Resident Evil fans. See, I like to actually call this topic, what makes a Resident Evil game a Resident Evil game, as fans go back and forth about games like RE4 and RE5, and they would argue that they are or are not real Resident Evil games. However, what really these fans are fighting about is what is better between survival horror and action horror, honestly, because these are the 2 main subgenres of horror that Resident Evil bounces back and forth between with each entry. I'll keep it simple. Some Resident Evil fans, myself included in this group, prefer games like RE2 Remake or the classic trilogy because these games feature limited saves, limited resources, inventory management, and focuses on atmospheric horror and the environment itself versus immediate tension caused from being overwhelmed. Those games are more survival horror, which, since this is what the franchise was built around, some fans would argue that only the entries of the series that prioritize survival horror are real Resident Evil games. This is why some of them attack RE4 and RE5 and obviously RE6 for not being true Resident Evil games. However, action horror is just another subgenre of horror that Resident Evil is known for. RE4 OG completely blew the horror community away, and it's one of the highest selling Resident Evil games despite it having little to no survival horror mechanics at all. Fans of action horror prefer the more fast-paced and explosive gameplay experience that some would argue features more replayability due to the excitement these games have versus a slower paced survival horror experience like the older Resident Evil games. The action horror games of the series, most of them that is, also features a merchant of some kind that allows you to purchase your weapons or resources or even receive an unlimited amount of ammo and healing items thanks to enemies dropping items or even a large amount of breakable boxes featured in each area. It's hard to say which subgenre is better because they both build on different features and mechanics that appeal to different types of horror gamers. As for me, I've always preferred survival horror over action horror, which is why my top 4 favorite games of the series are RE1 Remake, RE2 OG, RE2 Remake, and Resident Evil 7. All which are majorly focused on survival horror mechanics compared to games like RE4 and even Resident Evil Village. Number 5, co-op versus single player. Something that tends to go hand in hand with action horror versus survival horror is the debate in regards to if Resident Evil games should have co-op or not. Fans are kind of split on this mechanic. Looking at the first mainline Resident Evil game to feature co-op in the campaign, Resident Evil 5, fans still to this day argue back and forth about if this was actually a good idea or not. While on paper it made a lot of sense as it allowed RE fans to experience the game with a friend this time around, it also caused some complaints from the community. For example, fans felt like the co-op experience of Resident Evil 5 hit the final nail in the coffin that ultimately pushed Resident Evil over into the action genre versus the horror genre that the series was known for. Because it was a co-op experience, the game needed levels with more enemies and more weapons to create more intense situations, which ultimately took away from the horror completely. This is why some fans would argue that it was Resident Evil 5 that set the franchise down a dark path path that would ultimately lead to Resident Evil 6, one of the most controversial entries in the entire series. Don't worry, we'll talk more about that later. On the flip side of things, Resident Evil 5 became a lot of people's favorite Resident Evil game because it allowed them to experience the game with a friend. You could switch items, work together, and team up against all sorts of enemies, all while experiencing this with iconic Resident Evil characters like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker. Even RE6, a game that is very decisive among fans of the series, appealed to some gamers thanks to the ability to experience it with a friend. I'm someone that personally hates Resident Evil 6, yet every time I play it with a friend, I end up enjoying my time playing it a lot more than when I played it alone. Something about the co-op aspect of these games definitely added a unique experience that allowed us to enjoy these games in a different way, but there's also no denying the fact that it also took a lot of horror out of these games. So, because of what co-op did to the core gameplay experience, especially in regards to the horror, fans are honestly split about co-op in Resident Evil games going forward. Personally, I don't mind co-op in my bonus games like Mercenaries, but not in the campaigns. Like I said, it just takes away from the tension and the horror vibes I prefer to have in my Resident Evil games. Number 6, Stalker Enemies. Stalker enemy fatigue is a phrase that I didn't learn about until I became a content creator myself. The phrase is obviously in relation to stalker enemies in horror games, especially Resident Evil, that fans just feel as though the genre has become overly reliant on these types of enemies. For example, every Resident Evil game released in the last decade features at least one stalker enemy. Resident Evil 2 Remake has Mr. X, Resident Evil 3 Remake has Nemesis, RE7 has Jack Baker, and Resident Evil Village even had a Lady D. Hell, even RE4 Remake turned Chief Mendez into a stalker enemy in a small section of the Separate Ways campaign. And of course, it looks like Resident Evil Requiem won't be any different, as there's at least one confirmed stalker enemy in the game in the form of the hag chasing Grace Ashcroft. Now look, I get the argument, I really do. It's the same thing in almost every recent RE game, and it gets kinda old. Here's the thing though, I really love stalker enemies in Resident Evil. Something about a relentless enemy that you can't kill just adds a lot more horror and tension to the experience. Is it overused? Absolutely. Do I care? Not at all. In fact, I think stalker enemies are kind of a staple in the franchise, and at this point, they really need to have at least one of them in the game going forward. But yeah, a lot of people, quite honestly, the majority of fans would disagree with me there. Stalker enemy fatigue is a legit thing that a lot of creators, friends of mine, and other fans are tired of, and it's something that the community is kind of split on. You either like stalker enemies and what they add to the game, or you feel like it's lazy on Capcom's part, and it's just a cheap way to add horror to a game instead of being a little more creative. But yeah, you know what side I lean towards with this argument. Keep the stalker enemies coming, Capcom, because I'm all for them. Number 7, the yellow paint argument. For those that don't know, modern games, especially action horror games, have been known to hold the player's hands a little more than older games used to. By that, I mean that a lot of modern action horror games specifically add yellow paint to different objects and locations to inform the player where to go or what is breakable. This has become a thing that has really fired up the community as of late, and I don't think it's calming down anytime soon. On one side of the argument, you have the people that believe this type of mechanic completely takes the player out of the experience of the game, ruining the immersion completely. I mean, I get it. You're walking down a path and then all of a sudden there's just a whole lot of yellow paint randomly on the wall, basically saying, hey you dumbass, you can climb me. However, I also see it the other way around as well. Some fans feel like since modern games are bigger and allow for more exploration in wider locations, yellow paint on things just make it easier for you not to miss ledges that normally would be hard to see without the paint. They also can tell you that these boxes are breakable while these other boxes over here are meant to block your path and are not breakable. So yeah, I get it, I really do. I'm actually in the I don't care either way group, honestly. But it is something that I see a lot of people hating, so straight up, I just think games need to start adding a feature that turns it on and off going forward. Number 8, what is canon and what is non-canon? You would think that there's an established lore within the franchise as big as Resident Evil that basically confirms which games are canon and which games are not canon to the fans, yet there really kind of isn't. When it comes to the Resident Evil series, there's a lot of debate as to what games are important to the big picture of the Resident Evil series, and there's even more debate as to which ones are basically Elseworld stories. And Capcom doesn't really make things easy for us either, guys, because they pretty much take things from different games and retcon other key details in other games. Clearly, Capcom continues to change the lore, and it makes it kind of hard to follow as a fan and decipher what is canon and what is non-canon. Probably the biggest games that are debated being canon versus non-canon, though, are the Outbreak games. Up until the release of Resident Evil 7, the Outbreak games were largely viewed as non-canon. Different files in other Resident Evil games, for example, specifically name 5 survivors of the Raccoon City incident: Leon, Claire, Sherry, Jill, and Carlos. However, if we were to consider the Outbreak games as canon, then that means there should be other survivors. So yeah, up until Resident Evil 7, most people viewed the Outbreak games as non-canon, especially when Capcom themselves said that these games were not considered mainline games. But then in Resident Evil 7, we find an article with Alyssa Ashcroft's name on it, one of the playable survivors in the Outbreak games. We also hear a cop named Kevin talking on the radio in RE3 Remake, another playable survivor in the Outbreak games. Still, these could just be cute little Easter eggs for fans, but now that Alyssa Ashcroft is confirmed to be connected to the Raccoon City incident thanks to Resident Evil Requiem, it definitely blurs the line a lot more as to what is actually canon, which ultimately has fans speculating all over the place with each other right now. Number 9, the true Resident Evil 3. Okay, so this might sound like a weird thing to say out loud because clearly Resident Evil 3 should be the true RE3, right? Well, it's actually not that simple, at least for hardcore fans of the series that are aware of all the behind the scenes stuff with 2 games of the series specifically, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and Code Veronica. See, Capcom's original plan for RE3 was actually not Nemesis. Nemesis was never even supposed to exist. The original concept for Resident Evil 3 was supposed to be Code Veronica, and that game was originally planned to be the 3rd entry of the series, not Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. However, due to their contract with Sony, Capcom was obligated to release a 3rd Resident Evil game on the PlayStation 1 hardware. But Code Veronica was already in development on the next generation of video game consoles, which ultimately introduced a problem. So, how did Capcom solve this issue? Well, they created a brand new game for the PlayStation 1, reusing some assets and using other unused assets from Resident Evil 2, and the result was Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Now on the flip side, Code Veronica was instead turned into a spin-off game that wasn't a numbered entry like it was originally planned to be, ultimately creating an interesting question and debate among hardcore fans of the series that were well aware of the history between both games. Which Resident Evil game is actually the true RE3? Is Code Veronica the spin-off, or is Nemesis technically the spin-off? Honestly, I don't think it really matters. It doesn't matter if Code Veronica has a number attached to it or not, it's clearly a mainline entry of the series. So whether you view it as the true number 3 or not, both Nemesis and Code Veronica are extremely vital to the lore of the entire franchise, and I recommend playing both for that reason. But that won't stop some fans out there from fighting about which one should get the number 3 next to its name though. Trust me, that's all over the place. Number 10, what is the worst mainline Resident Evil game? Yeah, believe it or not, it's more controversial among fans of the series to talk about what the worst mainline RE game is than it is to talk about the best RE game. At least with the best games of the series, you can blame that on what appeals to a player more: survival horror versus action horror, fixed camera versus third person, who grew up with the originals and who were brought into the series with the remakes. However, when it comes to establishing what is the worst mainline game in the series, well, you're pretty much saying which game straight up sucks, and that doesn't bode well for fans that appreciate different things about different RE games. For example, for the longest time, I hated Resident Evil 6. I actively do not like that game, and I thought that everybody felt exactly the same way as I did. Yet, when I became a content creator and said those exact words out loud in my first Resident Evil franchise ranking video, boy oh boy did the RE6 fans come out to protect the hell out of that game and made sure I heard their opinions. I mean, these people actually went as far as saying that I was stupid and that I didn't understand how fun RE6 really was and that I was just jumping on the bandwagon. Yeah, it was pretty rough, not gonna lie. But let's take a look at another controversial game of the series, Resident Evil 3 Remake. This is a game that I personally enjoy a lot more than most people, even though I definitely prefer the original over the remake. But again, fans were quick to judge me for saying that it wasn't a bad game and were saying that it was awful and horrible and all these bad things, which I get, it was their least favorite game. However, there were also people on the opposite side of the argument that agree with me. This actually really applies to the entire series, really. Fans will hardcore defend which game is actually the worst in the series, and they do it passionately. Trust me, I've seen it. I've seen people say Code Veronica, RE0, Village, and RE7 are the worst in the series, and they'll be pretty vocal about how they feel about these games. Yet for me, all of those games are actually really good, with RE7 being in my top 3 or 4 of the series. That's my point though. Sometimes it's easy to tell which mainline entry in a franchise is the worst of the series. But when it comes to Resident Evil, you'll always have a lot of people fighting you over your pick for the worst game in the series, claiming that there are other games worse than your pick, ultimately making this a never-ending cycle. Me, yeah, RE6 is the worst mainline game of the Resident Evil series in my eyes, and I'm willing to bet that there will be a ton of comments at the bottom of this video crucifying me for those exact words, proving how decisive this topic really is. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Which controversial topic do you think is the most divisive in the Resident Evil community? Did it make my list? Let me know your thoughts down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Games. Take care.